Ukraine is facing its worst potential peril as a nation since the Stalin era of the 1930s and 1940s. There is now a consensus in the West amongst legal scholars and other experts that Putin's Russia and the Kremlin are seeking genocide in Ukraine. There is no debate now about this. There's also no debate what kind of regime is in Russia. This is a fascist dictatorship. Again, that's something that's changed very quickly in the last few years, particularly in the last 3. If that's the case, we can see that Ukraine cannot fail to win. If Ukraine is defeated in this war, it's the end of Ukraine as we know it, as what I have fought for nearly 4 decades. If Ukraine is defeated, there will be genocide in Ukraine. There will be mass murder of Ukrainian intellectuals, think tankers, journalists, religious leaders, and politicians. There is simply no question about this. There's no debate. We've already seen Russia in action, in areas it's occupied. It's deported 2.8 million Ukrainians to Russia. 2.8 million. It's mind-boggling. Which includes 500,000 children. It's given a huge number, something like 10,000 children who were stolen from orphanages, is given them for adoption to Russian parents. The objective of this is very simple. Russification. We're back to Stalinization and Russification. Executions with hands tied behind their backs, bullets in the back of their heads. Rapes. There's in the Bucha region of Kiev, over 500 women and children, young girls, were raped. And then often they were killed afterwards, many of them. This is therefore a time when we need to stand up and support and help Ukraine in any way we can. And we all can do different things. We all have different specialities. Where, of course, it's key in the case of Ukraine to allow it to help it to survive is 2 areas: military support from the West and financial economic support. Ukraine is running a budget deficit every month of billions of dollars. That needs to be stopped, need to be filled by Western financial economic support. That's because this year the Ukrainian economy will collapse by about 30 to 40%. That's as much as important as even the military side, because Putin is gambling on Ukrainian state going downhill and then having to negotiate for some kind of capitulation. That's what he wants. The military side is, of course, extremely important. And here's where Canada has been very disappointing. The reasons for this are manifold. One reason being, and this is not just a problem with the Liberal Party, it's a problem with all governments since 1991 in Canada, they've not put money into the military. Conservatives as well. Which is why Canada's in the bottom 5 of NATO's 30 members in terms of defense spending. In 2006, NATO made a ruling at one of its congresses that every member of NATO should spend 2% of GDP on defense. Canada has never reached that target. In fact, as of the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, then only 5 NATO members had reached that target: United States, Britain, France, Estonia, and Poland. Now it's gone up to about 12, but that's still a long way. So Canada's in a large number of countries, but nevertheless, Canadian military spending is very low, and that's probably a reason why Canada doesn't have very much to even give Ukraine. There's a lot of different types of military equipment from the West which Ukrainians are using. I've never seen a single bit of military kit which is Canadian, used on the battlefield. And I deliberately download as many videos as I can from the war, because I know that they probably will never survive for such a long period of time on the internet. This problem is being made worse by the recent scandals surrounding the turbine, where the Canadian government caved in to German and de facto Russian pressure to return a turbine from Nord Stream pipeline, which was being repaired in Canada. Canada should never have done that. And I think here probably most Canadian Ukrainians would agree with me. Certainly, the Canadian Ukrainian response should be not to vote for the Liberal Party whilst Justin Trudeau is its leader. If there's somebody else, that's a different matter. But not as long as Justin Trudeau, who has de facto betrayed Ukraine by not providing sufficient military support and by breaking Western sanctions by sending this turbine to Germany and then de facto on behalf of Russia. Russia is still, because of European use of Russian energy, Russia is still getting billions of dollars every day from selling gas to Europe, and that is in turn going into the military budget, which is in turn being used against Ukraine. So that was a major mistake on the behalf of Justin Trudeau, and I think this is just a reflection of him being a very, very weak leader, akin to what we had in the US with Barack Obama. And by the way, Barack Obama's name is de facto a dirty word in Ukraine, because in 2014, he also betrayed Ukraine. He opposed the sending of military equipment to Ukraine, and he didn't do anything in terms of helping Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum, where US was one of many guarantors of Ukrainian security. So Trudeau is joined the same club as Barack Obama. But we also have to ask, where has the Canadian Ukrainian community been active on these questions? And here I'm just really stunned at the passivity, I would call it. It's all relative, of course. I'm not saying Canadian Ukrainians are not doing anything, they are. But passivity on this military question. Look how quickly money has been raised to buy Turkish drones, the Bayraktar Turkish drones, which are about $5 million each. Latvians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Poles, Czechs, now Norwegians and Swedes are starting. These are all non-Ukrainians, raising money through crowdfunding and very quickly. Why is it the case then that no Ukrainian diaspora community has done the same? I just don't understand this. Is $5 million really a huge amount? Do we not have wealthy American Ukrainians and Canadian Ukrainians? We don't have them in Britain. I come from Britain. We don't have wealthy Ukrainian older generation businessmen in Britain. We just don't. But you do have a lot of them in Canada and America. And by the way, this money raised in these other countries, in the Baltic states, Poland, Scandinavia, Czech Republic, it's not raised by people with lots of money. They, I'm sure some of them were wealthy people, but primarily by small donations, crowdfunding. So everybody can donate, including, Canadian Ukrainians who are not very wealthy. This lack of military support to Ukraine is reflected in a recent opinion poll in Ukraine, where Ukrainians were asked, just a few weeks ago it came out, Ukrainians were asked, which countries do you believe have provided the greatest military support to Ukraine? And the three at the top, where they all received about 2/3, 65% of Ukrainians agreed, were United States, Great Britain, and Poland. Boris Johnson might be involved in scandals in Britain, but in Ukraine, he's been given Cossack status. He's a hero in Britain. Do you know how many percentage Ukrainians believe Canada was supporting Ukraine militarily? 3%. 3% Canada, 65% Poland, United Kingdom, and US. Why is that the case? I mean, surely then, if this is true, and I think it is, then that blows out of the water the mythology of Canada being this major, powerful center of the Ukrainian diaspora with a huge amount of influence. Well, we've seen that that influence has been exaggerated because Ukrainian Canadians were not able to stop Trudeau's government sending the turbine back. This goes back to a previous point of mine, which I've always argued when I lived in Canada, that Canadian Ukrainian organizations have never organized the investment and interest in supporting politics of contemporary Ukraine. Money goes into in researching, investigating the Holodomor. This has been going on for 3 decades. But you try and get money for anything to do with contemporary Ukraine, Ukrainian politics, forget it. I couldn't find any. I got, in 15 years in Toronto, I got 1 grant from Boris Sosnevsky. That was it. And it's also reflected in the fact there are hardly any Ukrainians in the Canadian Parliament, in the lower or upper houses. Ukrainians are falling behind Jews, Armenians, Sikhs, Indians, and other groups who are actively promoting themselves in Ukrainian politics. This is surprising as well because Ukrainians military is supported by a huge volunteer movement in Ukraine. This really is a people's war. I'm just writing a book now with my nephews, Stefan Yayechnik, who is a Canadian and Brit as well, he's got dual citizenship, on the invasion of Ukraine. And one of the chapters I've just written is about the volunteer movement in Ukraine. Volunteers are a major part of this military operation. It shows to what degree the Ukrainian nation is supporting the Ukrainian military. And one of the ways they're doing it is by supporting different types of drones. It's not just $5 million Bayraktar drones which are used on the Ukrainian front line. There's also a lot of use of commercial drones. These can be bought for $3,000 or $10,000. You can buy them on Amazon. And they can be adapted to military purpose by dropping grenades or bombs on the top of tanks, for example, which is the soft part and the easiest part to destroy a tank is from the top. Australia, not Australian Ukrainians, but Australians have just donated 300 of these smaller types of drones. Australia is a long way away from Ukraine, a lot further than Canada. And by the way, the Australian government's given a lot more military support to Ukraine than Canada has. I mean, there's Australian military vehicles are actually on the front line. I don't see any Canadian ones. There's a whole range of potential options that could be invested in. It's not just the 5 million Bayraktar Turkish drones. The irony of all of this is that it's strange that Canadian Ukrainians have not been able to crowdfund for even 1 Turkish drone. What is $5 million for the Canadian Ukrainian community? Especially because Bayraktar are so pro-Ukrainian. So every time one of these countries, whether it's Lithuanians or the Poles or the Czechs, have raised the money for a Bayraktar drone, the company, the Turkish company, has given the drone for free. So recently, Ukrainians in Ukraine raised money over only about 4 to 5 days to buy 4 Turkish drones. So $20 million. So Ukrainians in a war zone raised this. I don't understand why Canadians who are not in a war zone can't do this. Ukrainians in a war zone raised $20 million to buy 4 drones. The Turkish company Bayraktar gave the drones for free. And so Ukraine has used the money for the 4 drones to buy instead a satellite, which is going to be helping the Ukrainian military. That was announced just this week. The degree to which this is a very pathetic response on the behalf of the Canadian Ukrainian community can be seen in the fact that when a bank account was created to try to raise money to buy a drone, in the course of 2 months, only $100,000 has been collected. $100,000 of 5 million. And that's over 2 months. The Latvians have just raised €500,000 in 4 days. Why is it the case that non-Ukrainians can raise this money for drones and Canadian Ukrainians cannot? I think this is something that we should be discussing. Is it that, as I suspect, that the younger generation is not interested in giving up its nice cushy life and nice financial accounts? It wants to just live the good life, and they're basically all couch nationalists. They'll shout, with their beer in one hand and their fists in the other from their couches at the TV screen, and they'll cheer Ukrainians destroying tanks on YouTube, but they won't actually dip into their pockets. Sadly, my father's generation, that interwar generation, which was, I think, an amazing generation that established community structures in Britain, Canada, the US, Australia, and elsewhere. This, I would call it the UN generation of the 20s, many of whom were born in the 20s and 30s, have practically all died. My father's one of the last in his community, died 2 years ago at the age of 93. They would have given money, I think. If this invasion had happened 30 years ago when USSR disintegrated, then that generation was still alive and well and kicking, and I think they would have raised money for to buy probably more than one of these Turkish drones. So I think the problem is generational. I don't think that, sadly, that the generation below that, the second, third, whatever, fourth generations, are willing to simply dip in their pockets. They're couch nationalists. They're not real patriots of Ukraine. It's very sad, because what this means is that when the war ends, and the war will end with Ukrainian victory, I have no doubt, when the war ends, Ukrainians will know who were their true helpers. Canada will not be one of them. Both the Canadian government and the Canadian Ukrainian community. Nobody will no longer believe the myth that Canadian Ukrainians are influential as the biggest diaspora or as influential vis-a-vis the Canadian government. There'll be disappointment in Canada to the same degree there is disappointment in Israel, because Ukraine has a Jewish Ukrainian president who suffered from the Holocaust, his family, a country which has experienced the biggest Jewish revival in Europe since 1991, and yet Israel has refused also to send any weapons to Ukraine, to support Ukraine as well. So there's also disappointment in another country. In pretty much most of the West, the rest of the West, there is a great degree of thank you that this military aid is coming. And if this military aid had not been coming to Ukraine, Ukraine would have been defeated. The Ukrainian national identity, Ukrainian nation, would have been destroyed. Putin would have continued the work of Stalin. Which makes me ask, therefore, why are Canadian Ukrainians so passive when the potential dangers of Ukraine being defeated are so dire? This is not just a question of occupying territory. Putin wants to go further. When he talks about denazification, he's talking about murdering and destroying the Ukrainian nation. Let's not make any bones about this. The amount of rhetoric and discourse coming out of Moscow, including by the Russian ambassador to Austria just a few days ago, who talked about saying that the Ukrainian question needed to be dealt with once and for all. I mean, using language of Hitler and Stalin, means that we need to do as much as we can. Set yourselves the goal, Canadian Ukrainians. Meet the same targets as Poles, as the Baltic peoples, as Ukrainians in Ukraine. Raise money for at least 4 Bayraktar drones. And for other ones, the ones which are even cheaper, that you can buy. There's plenty of options of how you can help Ukraine militarily. The time is not now to be passive. The time now is to help Ukraine. And if we don't, then we will not be able to look ourselves in the mirror again. Thank you.